The rain had been falling since morning, coating the streets of Bath in a thin, silver sheen. Clara Bennett gripped the steering wheel as her car crawled through the narrow lane, the windscreen wipers beating in rhythm with her heart. Beside her, Lydia sat with arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the blurred world outside. The silence between them was heavier than the storm. "You always do this," Lydia muttered suddenly, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "You twist everything so that you're the victim." Clara's fingers tightened on the wheel. "Lydia, please, not today. We've just come from your father's house." "Exactly," Lydia snapped. "You made sure I never saw him properly when I was little, and now you act surprised that I actually like being there." Clara exhaled slowly, feeling the ache of years pressing against her chest. The memories came unbidden, nights alone with a crying child, lawyers' letters, Edward's cold smile as he walked away. She wanted to tell Lydia everything, the betrayal, the lies, but she couldn't. Not yet. The car rolled to a stop outside their small cottage at the edge of town. Rain dripped from the ivy-covered roof, and the sound of the river echoed faintly in the distance. Lydia flung the door open and stormed inside, leaving muddy footprints across the wooden floor. Clara followed quietly, watching her daughter retreat up the stairs. She wanted to call out, to say "I love you," but the words stayed trapped behind her lips. The echo of a slammed door was her only answer. That night, as thunder rolled over the hills, Clara sat by the window with a cup of tea gone cold. The glow of her phone screen caught her eye, a photo on social media, posted just minutes ago. Lydia and Edward, smiling together at a restaurant, with the caption, "Dinner with Dad." Finally. Clara's hand trembled as she set the phone down. The storm outside raged louder, but it could not drown the quiet, suffocating truth that settled inside her chest. Her daughter was slipping away from her. And for the first time, Clara realized she might not be able to pull her back. Morning came grey and cold, wrapping the town of Bath in a mist that clung to every rooftop. Clara stood by the kitchen window, her hands resting on the counter as she watched the rain slide down the glass. The kettle hissed softly, filling the silence that Lydia had left behind. She had not come home. Clara had waited all night, the living room lamp burning until dawn, but Lydia's room remained untouched. Her phone went straight to voicemail. There was only one place she could be. Clara drove through the drizzle to Edward's house in Cambridge, her mind replaying the last argument over and over. The moment she stepped out of the car, the contrast between their lives struck her like a blow. Edward's house gleamed with polished brick and trimmed hedges, while hers seemed to lean with exhaustion. The door opened before she could knock. Jeannie, Edward's new wife, stood there, her smile painted in polite sympathy. "Oh, Clara," she said, almost sweetly. "Lydia's here. She was quite upset last night, but she's calmer now. You know how teenagers are." Clara forced a thin smile. "May I see her?" Jeannie's smile tightened. "She's resting. I think it's best if she stays for a while." Edward agrees. Behind her, Clara caught a glimpse of Lydia in the hallway, laughing softly as Edward handed her a plate of pancakes. The warmth between them pierced through Clara like a blade. "Of course," she whispered. "If that's what she wants." Jeannie's expression softened, but her eyes gleamed with something else, something triumphant. As Clara turned back to her car, her chest felt hollow. For years she had fought for custody, for a chance to raise Lydia on her own, and now she was losing her without a single word from a judge. When she returned home, the house greeted her with its usual silence. On the kitchen table, the tea she had poured that morning had gone cold again. Clara sat down and stared at it for a long time, the weight of loneliness pressing down harder than ever. Then, out of habit, she reached for her phone. There was a message from her friend, Megan. "Heard about Lydia. Come to the cafe, you need a proper talk." Clara almost ignored it, until she realized she could not bear to sit in that quiet house another moment. The cafe was warm, scented with roasted coffee and cinnamon. Megan waved her over, her brow furrowed in concern. "She's with Edward now?" Megan asked. Clara nodded. "You did everything for that girl," Megan said. "Paid for her school, her clothes, her trips, while he and Jeannie just swoop in for birthdays and smiles." Clara smiled faintly. "It doesn't matter. If she's happy, that's all I care about." Megan leaned forward. "But is she really happy, Clara? Or just fooled by the picture he paints?" Clara had no answer. She stared out the cafe window where the rain had finally stopped. A thin beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, fragile and brief. For the first time, Clara wondered if letting Lydia go might be the only way to save herself. And deep down, she feared the door she left open might never close again. A week had passed since Lydia left, and the silence inside Clara's cottage had grown into something unbearable. The house seemed to echo with ghosts of laughter, of footsteps running down the stairs, of music that once drifted from Lydia's room. Now, all that remained was the faint smell of her perfume lingering on the sheets. Clara stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, her hands trembling as she touched the edge of the desk. The books were still there, stacked neatly in a way only Lydia would never do. It was Clara who had tidied them the day after she left, as though order could somehow replace presence. On the windowsill lay a photograph. Lydia, age 7, missing a front tooth, holding Clara's hand at the seaside in Brighton. The girl in the picture had clung to her mother with joy, unaware of how fragile love could become. The phone rang suddenly, cutting through the quiet. Clara snatched it up, hope surging for a heartbeat, but it wasn't Lydia. "Clara!" "It's Megan." Her voice was softer this time. "You should get out of that house, love. Come with me to the charity dinner tonight. It'll do you good." Clara hesitated. She hadn't gone anywhere social in months. But something inside her, a small, flickering spark, urged her to go. That evening, she stood before the mirror in a navy dress she hadn't worn since before the divorce. The reflection staring back at her looked older, yes, but not defeated. For the first time in a long while, she wanted to see herself again. The dinner was held in an old hall in Bath, lit by chandeliers that glowed like warm stars. People chatted over wine, and for a moment, Clara felt invisible until a voice called her name. "Clara Bennett. I can't believe it's you." She turned and froze. Standing before her was Raymond Elwood, a man she had once known well, kind, quiet, with eyes that had always seen too much. He had been there years ago, when her marriage was crumbling, offering friendship she was too afraid to accept. "Raymond," she breathed. "It's been years." "Too many," he said, smiling faintly. "You look, well. How have you been?" The question felt heavier than it sounded. Clara gave a careful smile. "Surviving." They spoke for a while about work, about the years that had passed, about nothing and everything at once. And as the evening grew late, Clara found herself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in years. When the dinner ended, Raymond offered to walk her to her car. The air was cool and scented with rain. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said quietly, as they reached the corner of the street. Clara looked up at him, startled. "You shouldn't have." "Maybe not. But I did." For a moment, the world seemed to still. Then she shook her head gently. "It's too late, Raymond. My life is complicated." He nodded, though there was sorrow in his eyes. "Then maybe it's time you made it simple again." Clara didn't answer. She simply watched him disappear into the mist, his figure swallowed by the dim glow of the streetlights. And as she drove home, her heart both ached and stirred because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her not as a mother, not as an ex-wife, but as a woman. When she arrived home, the house was as she'd left it, dark and waiting. But there, on the kitchen counter, was something new. A letter. Her name written in Lydia's hand. Clara stood frozen in her kitchen, staring at the envelope as though it might vanish if she blinked. The sight of Lydia's handwriting, familiar, curved, and a little careless, sent a tremor through her chest. She picked it up slowly, her fingers brushing the ink as if it could tell her what the words inside might hold. She hesitated. Part of her feared it would be cruel, another wound she wasn't ready to bear. Yet curiosity, or perhaps love, compelled her. She broke the seal. "Mum," it began. "I don't hate you, even if it sounds like I do. I just don't understand you. Dad says you kept me from him, but Jeannie says you're jealous, and I don't know who's right anymore. I wish you'd tell me the truth. I wish you'd stop looking so sad every time you see me. It makes me feel guilty just for being happy. I'm staying here for now. Dad says it's better this way. But sometimes, at night, I still want to come home. I miss the way you made tea when I was upset, and the smell of rain through my window. I just can't say that out loud. Not yet. Love, Lydia." Clara's eyes blurred as she read the last line. Her knees weakened, and she sank into a chair. The words were clumsy, uncertain, but they carried a trace of the little girl Lydia had once been, before anger and distance had taken her away. For a long while, Clara simply sat there, clutching the letter to her chest. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight fell across the table, illuminating the paper like a fragile truth. But peace, if it could be called that, did not last. That evening, Clara's phone buzzed again. A message from Megan. "Just saw something online. You might not want to look, but I know you will." Clara's pulse quickened. With trembling hands, she opened her social media app. There it was, a new post from Lydia. A picture of her and Jeannie, laughing in a garden full of roses. The caption read, "Heart to heart with Mum." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to tilt for a moment, the edges of the room blurring. Her teacup fell from her hand, shattering on the floor. The post was everywhere, friends commenting, heart emojis flooding in, everyone believing what the picture suggested. That Jeannie was the loving mother. That Clara had been replaced. She closed her phone and pressed her hands to her face. The ache inside her chest had no sound, only a quiet breaking that went on and on. Hours later, Clara found herself outside, walking aimlessly down the quiet lanes of Bath. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet stone and river mist. Lights glimmered faintly in cottage windows, lives still whole, still warm. And for the first time in her life, Clara whispered to the night, "I can't do this anymore." The words vanished into the dark, unheard. But she knew what they meant. Something inside her was giving way, not from anger, but exhaustion. And in that surrender, a strange thought began to take shape. Perhaps it was time to stop waiting to be loved. The next morning, Bath lay beneath a pale, uncertain sky. Mist drifted low over the rooftops, blurring the edges of the Georgian terraces. Clara sat by the window, the letter from Lydia resting beside a cold cup of tea. Sleep had eluded her once again, and her eyes were heavy with the weight of too many thoughts. She was about to rise when a sudden knock echoed through the cottage. It was sharp, deliberate, not the casual tap of a neighbor. Clara hesitated, her pulse quickening. Few people ever came unannounced. When she opened the door, a man stood before her. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat still wet from the mist, his expression cautious yet kind. "Mrs. Farrow?" he asked, his voice carrying a soft northern lilt. "Yes," she replied, uncertain. "Can I help you?" He removed his cap, revealing hair graying at the temples. "My name's Daniel Hensley. I believe we might need to talk about your daughter, Lydia." Clara's breath hitched. "My daughter? What about her?" He hesitated before speaking again. "I work at the Youth Support Center in Bristol. Lydia's been coming by, more often than she should, I'm afraid. We didn't want to alarm you, but she seems troubled. And last night, she mentioned something that made me think you ought to know. Clara gripped the edge of the door. What did she say? She spoke about wanting to disappear, he said gently. Said she was tired of being caught between two lives. She left before we could ask more. The words hit Clara like a blow. Her mind raced the letter, the post, the silence that followed. It all began to form a pattern she hadn't wanted to see. Do you know where she went? She asked, her voice barely steady. Daniel shook his head. No. But she mentioned a place somewhere she used to go when things felt too heavy. She called it the bridge. Does that mean anything to you? Clara's heart stopped for a moment. The Pulteney Bridge, she whispered. She used to stand there as a child, tossing pebbles into the water. Said she liked watching them vanish. Without another word, Clara grabbed her coat. I'll drive, Daniel offered, his tone firm but kind. The car ride was silent but heavy with dread. The mist thickened as they crossed into the city, the streets quiet, the river below reflecting a ghostly light. When they reached the bridge, Clara stepped out, her shoes clicking softly on the damp stone. At first, it seemed empty. Then she saw her a figure in a pale jumper, standing by the railing, her hair blown wild by the wind. Lydia. Lydia. Clara called out, her voice breaking through the fog. The girl turned, startled. Her face was pale, eyes red from tears. Mum. How did you? Please, come away from there, Clara said softly, taking slow steps forward. Lydia looked down at the river. I just wanted everything to stop. Everyone's pretending, and I don't know what's real anymore. Clara's throat tightened. You are real. That's all that matters. You're my daughter, Lydia, and I never stopped loving you. Not for a single moment. For a long, fragile second, the only sound was the rush of the Avon below. Then, slowly, Lydia lowered her hand from the railing. But before Clara could reach her, a sudden shout broke the stillness. Someone had seen them from the street and the sound startled Lydia, her foot slipping on the wet stone. Clara lunged forward. The scream that followed echoed against the bridge, swallowed by the mist. The splash echoed through the fog like a gunshot. Clara's scream tore through the air as she lunged over the rail, her fingers clutching at nothing but mist. The river Avon below churned and glimmered faintly through the grey cold, relentless, unforgiving. Lydia, she cried, her voice cracking, her body trembling with terror. Daniel was already beside her, looking down, scanning the current. There, he shouted, pointing to a pale shape caught in the eddy near the far arch of the bridge. Without hesitation, he vaulted over the parapet, disappearing into the river with a heavy splash. Clara could only watch, helpless, her heart pounding so violently she could scarcely breathe. Time lost all meaning. The world shrank to the sound of water and her daughter's name echoing in her mind. Moments later, Daniel surfaced, gasping, one arm hooked beneath Lydia's shoulders. He struggled against the current, shouting for help. Two men from the street rushed down the embankment, and together they pulled Lydia onto the slick stones of the riverbank. Clara stumbled after them, her boots slipping, her hands shaking as she knelt beside her daughter. Lydia's skin was white as porcelain, her eyes closed, lips trembling faintly with the shock of cold. Come on, sweetheart, Clara whispered, brushing wet hair from her face. Please, come back to me. Daniel pressed two fingers to Lydia's neck, searching. Then a flicker. A pulse. She's breathing, he said, relief washing over his face. Barely, but she's breathing. An ambulance siren wailed distantly, growing nearer, the sound slicing through the fog. Clara cradled Lydia in her arms, rocking her gently as if she were a child again, tears mingling with the rain. When the paramedics arrived, they worked swiftly, wrapping Lydia in blankets and lifting her onto the stretcher. Clara followed numbly, soaked and shaking, Daniel beside her, his coat dripping onto the cobblestones. At the hospital, time blurred again, flashing lights, voices, corridors. Lydia was taken into emergency care, and Clara was left standing outside the double doors, her reflection pale in the glass. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "She's strong," he said quietly. "She'll fight her way back." Clara nodded weakly. "I've failed her so many times." "You haven't failed," Daniel replied. "You're still here. That's what matters." But Clara barely heard him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the door, on the space beyond it where her daughter lay fragile, suspended between what had been and what might still be. For hours she waited in silence, every tick of the clock stretching like eternity. Then, just before dawn, the doors opened. A nurse stepped out, her expression soft. "She's stable," she said. "You can see her now." Clara followed, her legs weak beneath her. In the dim light of the room, Lydia lay sleeping, pale but peaceful, her hand resting loosely against the blanket. Clara took it gently in her own, feeling the faint warmth there, the steady rhythm of life. She leaned forward, whispering, "I'm here, my darling. I'm here." Lydia stirred, her eyelids fluttering, and for a heartbeat, Clara thought she might wake. But before she could speak, Lydia's lips moved and a single word escaped in a hoarse whisper. "Jeannie." Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The word lingered in the air like a blade, sharp and glinting with meaning. Clara sat frozen beside the bed, her hand still clutching Lydia's, her heart thundering in her chest. "Jeannie," she whispered again, barely audible. The name burned her throat as if it were poison. Lydia stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open for the briefest moment. She looked lost, confused, her lips trembling as if caught between dreams and reality. "Mum," she murmured weakly. "Yes, darling," Clara said, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I'm here. You're safe now." But Lydia's gaze drifted past her, unfocused. "Jeannie was here," she whispered. She told me the truth." Clara's breath caught. "What truth, love?" Before Lydia could answer, a nurse entered quietly, checking the monitors. "She needs rest, Mrs. Farrow. It's best not to push her right now." Clara nodded numbly, though her mind was a storm. She stepped back as the nurse adjusted Lydia's blanket, then slipped out of the room. Out in the corridor, she leaned against the cold wall, pressing her palms to her face. The name echoed in her skull, Jeannie. Always Jeannie. Even here, even now. Daniel approached quietly. "How is she?" "She's alive," Clara said softly. "But she mentioned Jeannie. Said she told her something." Daniel frowned. "Jeannie Patterson? The woman your ex-husband's with?" Clara nodded. "I don't know what she's done, but I'm going to find out." Later that afternoon, Clara found herself outside a neat townhouse on the edge of Clifton, Bristol. It was the same house she'd seen in the photos, Jeannie's house, the one with the rose garden where Lydia had smiled for the world. Her hand trembled as she rang the bell. The door opened after a few seconds, revealing Jeannie herself perfectly dressed, calm, her expression one of mild surprise. "Clara. What on earth are you doing here?" Clara's voice trembled, but her eyes were fierce. "Lydia nearly died this morning. She said your name before she collapsed." "What did you tell her?" Jeannie's composure wavered, if only slightly. "That's absurd. She came to see me, yes, but—" "Don't lie to me," Clara interrupted. "She's a child, Jeannie. Whatever you said pushed her to the edge." For the first time, Jeannie's expression hardened. "A child? She's 17, Clara. She's old enough to hear the truth you kept from her." Clara's breath caught. "What truth?" Jeannie took a step forward, her voice low and cold. "That she isn't just your daughter." Silence fell heavy between them. Clara stared, her face draining of color. "What do you mean?" Jeannie's eyes gleamed with something cruel, almost triumphant. "Didn't Robert ever tell you? Lydia was born before your wedding, before you were even in the picture. Her mother died giving birth. You were the second choice, Clara. The woman who stepped in when the real story became inconvenient." Clara staggered back as if struck. "No. That's not true. He told me." "He told you what you needed to believe," Jeannie said smoothly. "But Lydia knows now. I made sure of it. She deserves to know where she came from." Clara's throat tightened. The air around her seemed to twist and close in. "You did this to hurt me." Jeannie gave a thin smile. "You hurt yourself, Clara. You built your life on someone else's lie." The words cut deep, leaving Clara trembling in the doorway. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away down the neat, sunlit path, past the perfect roses that now looked like splashes of blood. She didn't look back. But as she reached the end of the street, her knees buckled, and she sank against the cold stone wall. Everything she had believed, every memory, every sacrifice had been built on a story that was never hers to begin with. And somewhere, in a hospital bed in Bath, her daughter lay between truth and recovery, waiting for a mother she might no longer recognize. The morning was unusually still in Bath, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The post had arrived early, the usual stack of bills and advertisements, but one envelope lay apart on Clara's kitchen table. It was written in a familiar, careful hand, Lydia's. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, slightly crumpled at the edges, as though it had been written and rewritten many times. The ink was smudged, and her daughter's words began with hesitation. "Mum. If you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to say it out loud. I'm sorry. For everything. I thought Dad's world was perfect. I thought you were the one who ruined it. But I see now that you were the only one who truly loved me enough to stay, even when I pushed you away." Clara sank into the chair, tears tracing down her cheeks. The letter went on, describing how Edward's attention had faded once Lydia moved in, how Amelia's kindness was a thin disguise for control, and how lonely the grand house in Cambridge had become. "I miss you, Mum. I miss the smell of your tea in the mornings, the way you used to hum when it rained, even the silly notes you'd leave in my lunch. I thought I didn't need you, but I was wrong. I need you more than ever." At the bottom, the final lines blurred through Clara's tears. "Please don't forget me. Please come home one day. I'll be waiting." Outside, the church bells tolled in the distance. The sound echoed through Clara's chest, not with sorrow this time, but something softer. Hope, fragile yet alive. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her heart. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that forgiveness was not a dream lost in the past. It was something being written, quietly, in the present. Far away, in Cambridge, Lydia stood by her window, watching the rain trickle down the glass. A small smile formed on her lips as she sealed another letter, one she would finally send this time. And somewhere between Bath and Cambridge, between mother and daughter, the distance began to fade.